It was the Potentate who declared the Second Era had begun. Can you imagine a man so imposing that he would declare the end of an entire era? Truly, the Akaviri people must have been quite influential to have such an impact.
"430 years of Cyrodiil's history belongs to the Akaviri in the form of the Akaviri Potentate, which lasted from Second Era Year 1 to Second Era Year 430. Due largely in part to Reman Cyrodiil, for over 400 years the Imperial City was ruled by the serpent folk of Akavir, the Shaie, which led to an increase in Akaviri culture throughout Tamriel and even a unique subrace of Imperials. I don't often hear people talk about this span of time, so I personally wanted to learn more about it. I already knew the win of it, but I wanted to figure out what it really was, how it came to be, who its leaders were, why it fell, and what became of it. If you're new to the Elder Scrolls, or even if you're familiar, you may be confused by some of the things I just said. What the hell is a Shaie, for instance? Well, if you're at all confused by that particular question, I have an entire lore video dedicated to that topic, which I will link right now, that I suggest you watch either before or after this one. If you're confused about anything else that I just said, it will likely be covered in this very video, so please sit back, relax, and enjoy as I explain all about the Akaviri Potentate and its unique place in Tamriel's history. But, like any true historical work, in order to better understand the Akaviri Potentate, we must first start from the beginning. Now, I already have a video that briefly talks about Reman as well, if you don't know who he is or was, and that video will be linked in the description too, but it's not as imperative of a watch. That video is specifically about Dragonborns, not Reman, so for this one I want to take a more focused dive into who he was as an individual. We have the foundational mythos about Reman's birth at Sancred Tor, the Remanata, chapters 1 and 2, and we can look at these to figure out the idea that became about Reman's origins. Chapter 1 is titled Sancred Tor and the Birth of Reman. In this myth, Reman's father, King Hrol, sees the spirit of Saint Alessia, the first Empress of Cyrodiil, rested in a hill. King Hrol then makes love to the hill, which slowly begins to grow into a small mountain. Villagers begin to gather around the mound as it grows, believing that it withheld some great importance, and these villagers named the site Sancred Tor, meaning Golden Hill. After 9 months, a cry was heard from on high of this holy hill. A shepherdess by the name of Sediana mustered the strength to find the source of this wail. At its peak, she found an infant boy impressed with a gem in his forehead, the Amulet of Kings. And from this most holy of sights, she so named the boy Reman, Light of Man. Now it's important to remember that this story is called a fragmented mythical recounting of the conception of Reman and the return of the Kim al-Adabal with the people of Tamriel. It's a myth. And just like all myths, it may have once been inspired by something that happened at Sancred Tor, but in all likelihood, Reman was not physically born from a hill. He may have been left there as a child, and from that the myth arose. Again, I go over this more in depth in my Dragonborn video, but that's just one example of a likely scenario that this could have been. What this does show us is that Reman was highly important to the people of Cyrodiil, and there was an attempt made to connect him to the Empress of the First Empire in some sense, making him the spiritual successor to the Imperial crown, which had lied dormant from Dragonborn emperors for around 400 years. Reman went by the name Reman Cyrodiil, but the province was not named after him. Rather, Reman took up the name Cyrodiil to reflect his people. Reman's first, and realistically his most important, event is the Battle of Pale Pass. Pale Pass was a monumental battle during the first Akaviri invasion of Tamriel in First Era 2703. Reman was able to unite the Imperials under the banner of Cyrodiil once more during this war, and at Pale Pass he demonstrated his power of the Thu'um, proving himself Dragonborn and thus worthy of the throne of Cyrodiil. The Akaviri invaders surrendered to Reman after this demonstration, reportedly claiming that they had been looking for a Dragonborn to support. And from there, Reman unites and then leads the people of Cyrodiil. During his reign, these conquered Akaviri would go on to insurmountably change the history of Tamriel forever. To quote from the PGE-1, "The Second Empire is divided into 2 stages, the Reman Dynasty and the Akaviri Potentate. As mentioned in the text, after the Akaviri raiders had been defeated, Reman recruited many of them into his service. Later Cyrodiils traditionally kept a house guard of Akaviri, and the Emperor's chief advisor, the Potentate, was usually of Akaviri descent. Other Akaviri slaves played a significant part in establishing the administrative structures of the Second Empire, as well as in the training of its military. The restructured Imperial Legions, which learned an unparalleled measure of coherence, logistics, and discipline from the Akaviri, began to easily overwhelm the other regional armies. Soon every region in Tamriel belonged to Cyrodiil except for Morrowind. After the assassination of Reman's last heir by the Dark Elven Morag Tong during the disastrous Fourscore War, control of the Empire reverted to the Akaviri Potentate. They have left a visible mark on the Empire of today. The high crafts of daikatanas and dragon-scale armor came from Akavir, as did the banners and military dress of Septim's shock troops, the Blades. The red dragons that have come to represent the Empire and the Imperial City were originally Akaviri war mounts. Akaviri surnames are rare and prized possessions among the Cyrodiilic citizenry of today, and there are trace facial features of the Akaviri in many distinguished Cyrodiilic families. Some colonies of true Akaviri still exist in both the Empire and its border regions, but they are named so only for their practices and customs than for the purity of their blood. And a further quote from the PGE-3. The next great transformation of the land came from distinctly external forces. The foiled Akaviri invasion of 2703 brought about a new dynasty and a new spirit of cooperation among independent nations dedicated to fighting the common threat. Under the Emperor Reman I, Cyrodiil became truly cosmopolitan, incorporating aspects of High Rock, Colovia, Nibene, and the sophisticated if strange culture of the defeated Akaviri into a common whole. The Cyrodiilic Empire, also called the Second Empire, began again the process of expansion, founding a strong single nation, if not actually succeeding in conquering the entire continent. Now, the pocket guides to the Empire are not always reliable sources, but this mostly applies when talking about imperial propaganda and misinformation regarding other races/provinces. When analyzing these two passages, looking purely for the facts, it doesn't seem like this information is false. It may be overstating the effectiveness of the imperial armies, but the point that it gets across is that there was a great impact the Akaviri had on the Imperials during the Second Empire. With that in mind, Cyrodiil experienced a lot of cultural growth during this period and was largely influenced by the Akaviri culture that Reman had not only conquered but integrated into his government. The position of Potentate was introduced during the Reman dynasty as an advisor position to the emperors, and the legions were reorganized according to Akaviri standards, as I read previously. It's extremely interesting to me that the Akaviri were incorporated into the empire so heavily prior to their takeover during the Akaviri Potentate proper, and it's eye-opening to see how much they truly impacted before the time of Versidue-Shaie. After the death of Reman I, who never openly took the title of emperor, there were at least 4 who did take up that title after him who continued his lineage: Kostav, Reman II, Brasilis Dor, and Reman III. One of the most noteworthy events of the Second Empire was the Fourscore War, which was initiated by Reman II. After his conquest of Blackmarsh in First Era 2837, he turned his eye towards Morrowind in an attempt to bring the Ashen homeland of the Dunmer under the banner of the Second Empire as well. By First Era 2840, the so-called Fourscore War had begun. This ended poorly for Reman II, as he was killed on the battlefield in First Era 2843 at the age of 57, but the war continued throughout the rest of the Reman dynasty. Emperor Reman III was the last of the Reman dynasty, and his Akaviri Potentate was the aforementioned Versidue-Shaie. On the 6th of Sun's Dusk, 2920, Reman III agreed with one of Morrowind's god kings, Vivek, to a treaty to end the Fourscore War for good. However, according to this book series, 2920, The Last Year of the First Era, which is a historical fiction series written by an in-universe historian, Potentate Versidue-Shaie is believed to have murdered Reman III, or at the very least, is believed to have hired the Morag Tong to assassinate him, before he had a chance to ratify the treaty. "The Cyrodiil line is dead," announced the Potentate to the crowd gathered beneath the speaker's balcony of the Imperial Palace. "But the Empire lives.
The distant relatives of our beloved emperor have been judged unworthy of the throne by the trusted nobility who advised his imperial majesty throughout his long and illustrious reign. It has been decided that, as an impartial and faithful friend of Reman III, I will have the responsibility of continuing on in his name.
Now, exactly why Versidue-Shaie had Reman III killed is mysterious, much like all else that comes from Akavir, but the goal could have been as simple as wanting more power. And it was power that Versidue-Shaie achieved.
I want to make it clear that I am not taking the title Emperor, he continued. I have been and will continue to be Potentate Versidue-Shaie, an alien welcomed kindly to your shores. It will be my duty to protect my adopted homeland, and I pledge to work tirelessly at this task until someone more worthy takes the burden from me. As my first act, I declare that in commemoration of this historical moment, beginning on the 1st of Morning Star, we will enter year 1 of the Second Era, as time will be reckoned. Thus, we mourn the loss of our imperial family, and look forward to the future.
And so dawns the Second Era and the Akaviri Potentate, the Age of Snakes. So we've finally arrived at the Akaviri Potentate, marked by the death of Reman III and the ascension of Versidue-Shaie upon the Ruby Throne. And what do we know of this period? Well, we can actually take a look back at the Remanata, Chapter 2, for some starting information. In Chapter 2, titled The Chevalier Renaud, the Blade of the Pig, a new stage of the story is expanded upon, this time set during the Akaviri Potentate and beyond. I will quote the whole of it here as to give you a greater understanding of what we're working with. And in the days of the interregnum, the Kim El Adabal was lost again amid the petty wars of gone heathen kings. West and East knew no union then, and all the lands outside of them saw Cyrodiils as a nest of snake men and snakes. And for 4 more hundreds of years did the seat of Reman stay sundered, with only the machinations of a group of loyal knights keeping all its borders from throwing wide. These loyal knights did go by no name then, but were known by their eastern swords and painted eyes, and it was whispered that they were descended from the bodyguard of old Reman. One of their number, called the Chevalier Renaud, discovered the prowess of Cullacane, and then supported him towards the throne. Only later would it be revealed that Renaud did this thing to come closer to Talos, Anon Stormcrown, the glorious yet Emperor Tiber Septim. Only later still, that he was under instruction by a pig. Long Glory was wife to the All-Knights of the Dragon Banner, who knew no other, and were brothers before beyond many seas, and now were brothers under the law named the Blade Surrender of Pale Pass. And having vampire blood, these brother knights lived for ages through and past Reman, and then kept guard over his ward, the Coiled King, Versidue-Shaie. The snake captain Vershue became Renaud, became the protector of the northern west when the black dart was hooked into Savirien-Chorak. Here, torn pages indicate that the rest of the ancient book has been lost. There is a lot that's said in this text block. For the purposes of this video, this quote explains that the bodyguards of Reman were made up of the Seichi, the supposedly immortal snake men of Akavir, who were actually from the Akaviri that surrendered to Reman back at Pale Pass. They became the Dragon Guard, who of course later became the Blades, and they kept things running in the background. Because these men in particular had vampiric blood, i.e. immortality, they outlived not only Reman but also all of his heirs, and would further go on to serve as guards over Versidue-Shaie. So, just know that in the background of all this potentate stuff, there was this immortal group of warriors running around Cyrodiil committing all sorts of shadowy behavior of this nature. And that's nice and all, but let's talk about Versidue-Shaie. He's honestly the reason that I wanted to make this video in the first place. There's not that much information that I knew about him going into this. With that in mind, trigger warning, ESO content will be heavily touched upon next because Shaie and the Akaviri Potentate have had a ton of lore added about them over the past decade of the game's life cycle. Versidue-Shaie began his reign by signing the Servant Truce, ending the Fourscore War, which he killed Reman III before he could do. Versidue-Shaie greeted Vivec at the front door.
"I'm glad you received the message before you got all the way to the city," said the Potentate, guiding his guest into the large, warm drawing room. "We are in a difficult transition time, and for the moment, it is best not to conduct our business at the capital." "There is no heir?" asked Vivec. "No official one, though there are distant cousins vying for the throne. While we sort the matter out, at least temporarily, the nobles have decided that I may act in the office of my late master."
Versidue-Shaie signaled for the servants to draw 2 comfortable chairs in front of the fireplace.
"Would you feel most comfortable if we signed the treaty officially right now, or would you like to eat something first?" "You intend to honor the Emperor's treaty?" "I intend to do everything as the Emperor."
Personally, I think the reason that he killed Reman III when he did was so that this event, the signing of the Servant Truce, could begin his reign off on the right foot, and he could be seen in the eyes of the people as a savior and a great negotiator. As an example, we hear from High King Emeric during the Interregnum high praise of Shaie for this act. Versidue-Shaie was a peacemaker who ratified the Servant Truce that ended the disastrous Fourscore War with Morrowind. Versidue-Shaie then seems to have started off his reign well, or at the very least has projected an upstanding image of himself in that way for some. And for others, the story is obviously much more sinister. Almost immediately, Versidue-Shaie is said to have begun the Reman Purges, which was a roughly 300-year period of time in which Reman loyalist families and supporters were either imprisoned or hunted down and killed by the Potentate's soldiers and armies. The Potentate integrated many different types of cavalry into the Imperial armies to help aid in these purges. What I don't like here is that these different animals in the cavalry only exist because you could find them in loot boxes in the Elder Scrolls Online. But I do have to admit that I personally kind of like the lore. I like the idea of Reman Purges. What I have a hard time with is taking the Akaviri Potentate pony, for example, very seriously. But the lore we hear from these crown crates is, in 2nd Era 5, companies using the new enchanted barding design by Versidue-Shaie's battle mages received their orders. Hunt and kill Reman loyalists. Though initially only horses, ponies and more earned the special barding and training. And there are several more of these crown crate, loot box, lore bits. Here's the full list of animals canonically used by the Akaviri Potentate as mounts to slaughter Reman loyalists. Wolves and wolf cubs, horses and ponies, saber cats and saber cat cubs, bears and bear cubs, camels, and gwar calves. There were even magical wolves, horses, and cinches that were added to the mix later on. Again, this is according to collectibles in loot crates, so feel free to take this lore or leave it. By 2nd Era 11, Versidue-Shaie turned the Isle of Aminos, or Aminos, in the Sisters Isles into a penal colony. That means a prison island for all my non-Australian viewers. Aminos became specifically a penal colony for Reman loyalists. And in the early 2nd Era, Shaie also commissioned the construction of the Black Rose Prison in Blackmarsh. So it would seem like High King Emeric is completely fucking crazy for thinking that Versidue-Shaie was a good ruler and peacemaker with him having to create all of these prisons. But it gets much worse. See, Versidue-Shaie's reign lasted from 2nd Era 1 to 2nd Era 324, which is easy math, a 324-year span as the ruler of Cyrodiil. This lifespan is unnaturally long, clearly, and again, I touch on this stuff more in that Seichi video and why the Seichi are so confusing. But regardless, Shaie's reign was long, and honestly, at the time of writing this script, there's not much known about it in between the years of 2nd Era 42 and 2nd Era 283. Hopefully these blank spots in the lore will be fleshed out in the future games at some point, seeing as the Akaviri Potentate was such a long span of time. Anyway, the history of the Fighters Guild tells us that Versidue-Shaie's reign on the Ruby Throne had begun to wear thin by 2nd Era 283. The vassal states in Tamriel were now in full-on rebellion against him and began openly challenging his right to lead the people of Cyrodiil. Shaie naturally declared universal martial law for himself during this time and waged war against these rebellions for the next 37 years. When the dust had finally settled, Shaie and his government were the victors, but victors in a broken land. All the wealth and manpower in the lands had been eaten up during the conflict, leaving a completely wrought and poor Cyrodiil behind. Before, the princes of Tamriel would not pay his taxes. Now, they could not. Completely spent and nearly defenseless, Versidue-Shaie began consolidating his power back in Tamriel. During the war, for example, he privatized the Sisters' Isles and placed their stewardship under the Brittonic House Mornard. By the year 320 of the Second Era, another Sachi of Shaie's kin, Dinieris Vez, the Iron, presented himself before the Potentate and produced a plan to help gain control once more. Mercenaries for hire, who could be hired by nobility in lieu of a standing army. The employment would be temporary, and a percentage of their fees would go to the Potentate's government, thus putting salve on 2 of Versidue-Shaie's greatest pains. This organization was at first known as the Sifim, which is the Sachi word for soldiers, since the original idea for this group was for it to be composed of entirely Akaviri, or entirely Sachi, mercenaries. However, it was eventually seen that the folk of Tamriel would behoove the Sifim to include within their ranks. The Sifim was a success. Young men and women, for a variety of reasons, because of desperate poverty, for love of action and adventure, in order to aid their crime-stricken neighbors, joined his new order en masse. They received training and were immediately put to work helping the aristocracy's problems, assuming the roles of guards and soldiers within their locality. And the success of this guild is what caused Versidue-Shaie to officially create the Guilds Act of 2nd Era 321. This act officially sanctioned the Mages Guild, which had already been operating, alongside the tinkers, cobblers, prostitutes, scribes, architects, brewers, vintners, weavers, rat-catchers, furriers, cooks, astrologers, healers, tailors, minstrels, barristers, and the Sifim, which would go on to become better known as the Fighters Guild. This is one of the most important things to know about Shaie's reign throughout Cyrodiil, though the Reman purges were certainly interesting too. At some point around 2nd Era 309, the Potentate began upholding a residency in the city of Senchal due to the strengthening of imperial ties within Palatine. He even had his own manor built outside the city, known as the Potentate's Retreat, where Shaie used this home to potentially get away from prying eyes and entertain guests from time to time as needed. In 2nd Era 324, one fateful night in Senchal would bring about the downfall of the Potentate, as his corpse was found in the palace with the words Morag Tong smeared across the walls using the Potentate's own blood as a wicked ink. Whether or not the Morag Tong were actually involved is hard to say. The book The Brothers of Darkness suggests that this was the first actual known murder committed by the group, despite the fact that they also allegedly killed Reman III as well, and several others before and after the fact. All of that really isn't important. The point is, Versidue-Shaie was assassinated in 2nd Era 324, yet the Akaviri Potentate remained. Shaie was succeeded by his son, Savirien-Chorak, who has a much less dense reign to talk about. The first thing that Savirien-Chorak did as the new Potentate was to reinstate the armies of Cyrodiil, rather than have the Fighters Guild be the only source of martial protections within the lands. Very interestingly, we have Savirien-Chorak to thank for actually bringing Orsinium under the banner of the Empire as well for the first time in Tamriel's history. If we ask High King Emeric again, his successor, Savirien-Chorak, was not quite so able an administrator, and often responded poorly to the crises that began, in his era, to pull the Empire apart. But he was wise enough to recognize that it's better to have the Orcs of Hrothgar as your friends than as enemies, and it was he who finally brought Orsinium into the Empire. And we have some lore about Chorak hosting a celebration on the 400th year of the Second Era, celebrating 400 years of Akaviri rule in Cyrodiil. The festivities lasted for months, and there were games, revelry, and supposedly even a poetry competition that happened. Niall Dumaris was the winner, and was proclaimed the Poet Champion of Cyrodiil, but rejected the title and went on with her life thereafter. Unfortunately for Savirien-Chorak, his reign was cut much shorter than his father's when, in the year 430 of the Second Era, he and all of his kin were assassinated by either the Morag Tong or the Dark Brotherhood. Sources vary. Whatever the case, the lineage of Versidue-Shaie and Savirien-Chorak ended that night, and within a fortnight, the Akaviri Potentate fell, and thus began the Age of the Interregnum, a time period where warlords contested over the Ruby Throne for another 400 years until the Age of Tiber Septim. Versidue-Shaie reigned for 324 years, and Savirien-Chorak for a measly 106. Both had extremely, strangely long lifespans, and both were, in the end, not the most effective leaders for their times. Let's wrap up by talking about what became of the remaining Akaviri influence in Cyrodiil. To be honest with you, this section is going to be relatively short. After the downfall of the Akaviri Potentate, we have a bit of lore coming from the PGE-1 about the whereabouts of the remaining Seichi. Though ostensibly its own kingdom, Rimmen still pays tribute to the Main of Elsewhere, from whose realm it seceded in Common Era 812 during the Interregnum. Earlier, Akaviri refugees had fled persecution when the warlord Atribis briefly aspired to the imperial throne. Atribis, though he lasted no longer than most of the pretender kings of that period, thought he might rid Cyrodiil of the foreigners who had ruled it for the first half of the Common Era, and he drove the Akaviris past the Empire's borders into Elsewhere. The Khajiit granted them asylum in the hills and steeps of northwestern Elsewhere, where they dwelt in relative seclusion until remnants of the Dir Kamal resurfaced in Cyrodiil, seizing the throne from Atribis' successors. The Rimmen, literally the Rimmen as the Khajiit called them, joined their brothers to try to rebuild the empire. This effort was doomed to failure, but not before the Khajiit attempted to reclaim their lands in a series of bloody border wars. Currently, since the ascension of Tiber Septim, the hapless Rimmen have once again submitted to the protection of the Main, with a renewed tribute paying for the Cat Lord's guarantee of their independence, a truly weak reed upon which to lean. I'm a firm believer that there are many Akaviri that still exist throughout Tamriel, we just don't know it. But we do know that at the very least a large majority of them were displaced out of Cyrodiil and into Elsewhere during the Interregnum. They are now known as the Rimmen, and in fact one of these refuges, a town named Hakashe, can be found in Elder Scrolls Online. But the Seichi live on in a much more important way than just the town of Hakashe or the Rimmen. They left a long-standing cultural impact on the people of Cyrodiil, whether they'd like to admit it or not. They ruled alongside the Reman Dynasty for about 217 years, and then ruled as potentates for 430 years, for a combined 647 years of sheer influence. That's longer than the real-life Roman Empire, the Khmer Empire, the British Empire, and roughly 2.5 times longer than the United States of America has existed for. I said this earlier, but to quote the PGE-1 again, they, the Akaviri, have left a visible mark on the empire of today. The high crafts of dai katanas and dragon scale armor came from Akavir, as did the banners and military dress of Septim's shock troops, the Blades. The red dragons that have come to represent the empire and the imperial city were originally Akaviri war mounts. Akaviri surnames are rare and prized possessions among the Cyrodiilic citizenry of today, and there are trace facial features of the Akaviri in many distinguished Cyrodiilic families. Some colonies of true Akaviri still exist in both the Empire and its border regions, but they are named so only for their practices and customs rather than for the purity of their blood. In kind of a strange meta sense as well, when you really think about it, the iconic dragon logo for Skyrim probably wouldn't exist without the Akaviri either, since that's actually the symbol for the Empire. So I hope you enjoyed this dive into the Akaviri Potentate. Seriously, if you haven't seen my Seichi video, I hope you'll consider checking it out, as it importantly ties into the Akaviri culture that was discussed in this video, and what the hell a Seichi even is. If you're looking for more content around this time period, also please check out Honored Madman. He's a lore YouTuber that I really enjoy, and I saw he posted a video about Reman a few weeks ago, so I'll link that below in the description. I haven't seen it myself yet, but I'm hoping to watch it soon when I have time. And as usual, I'd like to give a big shout out to all my channel members, each of whom I greatly appreciate for being able to donate a small portion of their income to help uplift this channel. It's very motivating and reassuring that even throughout the skim posting I've done the past few months, that I still have your support. I truly mean it. It just means a ton. Anyway, I've been Dariloth. I have a lot of other Elder Scrolls videos. Please go check them out if you're interested. Leave a comment on this video, share it, send it to your dad. I dare you. And if you'd like to watch more, consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.